Witam Was, jesteśmy na 24, jeżeli dobrze liczymy, czwartku social media, czyli to już 2 lata. I dzisiaj przygotowaliśmy dla Was w sumie coś specjalnego. Głównym punktem programu jest nasz gość z zagranicy, Euan Semple. I tak, jaki jest cały program? Najpierw ja krótko powiem o tym, dla kogo jest dzisiaj zbiórka charytatywna, bo jest też zbiórka i zapraszam wszystkich, którzy chcą zrobić coś dobrego do korytarza. Tam jest stolik i można zakupić różne przedmioty w naprawdę niskich cenach. A zbiórka jest na Piotrka, który urodził się bez rąk i bez nóg i potrzebuje rehabilitacji, także zachęcam Was do tego. Plan jest taki, że najpierw Czarek z XTB 2 minuty opowie o jednym z projektów, które prowadzą, a później już będzie naszym gościem Euan, który będzie miał swoją prezentację. Nie będę zdradzał na jaki temat. Następnie Ilona Grzywińska, web komunikacja, będzie z Euanem rozmawiała. Nie wiem w sumie o czym, zobaczymy. I na koniec, po rozmowie, oczywiście pomiędzy zrobimy przerwę, żeby się nie ugotować i móc napełnić zbiorniki. Po rozmowie Ilony będzie prezentacja chłopaków z showroomu, którzy też nie wiem do końca o czym opowiedzą. I jeszcze właśnie ważna bardzo rzecz. Chcielibyśmy podziękować naszym sponsorom, w zasadzie sponsorom przyjazdu dzisiejszego naszego głównego gościa, Euana, czyli agencji The Digitals i agencji Buzz Media. Bardzo dziękujemy za możliwość jakby zaproszenia takiego gościa. Mamy nadzieję, że to nie pierwszy, nie ostatni raz. Jest też gdzieś tutaj na sali IDG, które nagrywa materiał o czwartkach, więc też możecie się wypowiedzieć, powiedzieć swoje 3 słowa na temat tego, jak widzicie te spotkania. I nie wiem, czy o czymś nie zapomniałem. Dawid? Nie ma Dawida. Dobra, jesteś. O wszystkim powiedziałem, co miałem powiedzieć? Dobra, to teraz nasz pierwszy krótki występ naszego gościa, Czarek z XTB. Już przekazuję mikrofon.
Dziękuję. Witam wszystkich. Miło Was widzieć tak licznie i w tych jakże sprzyjających warunkach przyrody, bo pamiętam miesiąc temu spotkanie odbywało się tuż przed Białą Wielkanocą. Także przechodząc szybko do rzeczy, ostatnio jak tutaj byłem, mówiłem o konkursie, który przygotowaliśmy dla dziennikarzy, blogerów. Konkurs był wtedy w przededniu, teraz się zakończył. No i było ciekawie, było intensywnie, było dużo emocji. Natomiast chcielibyśmy ogólnie relacje i komunikację do blogerów, bo z dziennikarzami rozmawiamy już od jakiegoś czasu, ale z blogerami chcielibyśmy się lepiej skomunikować w najbliższych miesiącach. Jakby kontynuacją tego konkursu, bo w pierwszej 10 konkursu, to może być dla Was ciekawostka, było tylko 3 dziennikarzy, tak, finansowych zajmujących się na co dzień tematyką, którą my się zajmujemy w naszej działalności, czyli Forexem, giełdą i tak dalej. Było 8 blogerów, 7 blogerów. To oznacza, że wiedza czy też intuicja, wyczucie pewnych spraw związanych z tym rynkiem gdzieś jest, natomiast wiem, że potencjał zawsze można rozwinąć i dlatego chcielibyśmy, korzystając również z tej okazji dziś, zaprosić wszystkich, którzy chcieliby dowiedzieć się więcej o giełdzie, o Forexie, o rynku, o tym, jak to działa i po co to jest i dlaczego, na spotkania do nas. Zrobimy to w 10-15 osobowych grupach. Jeśli ktoś jest chętny, to zapraszam albo do kontaktu przez facebookowy profil Czwartków, albo do mnie na maila cezary.andrzejczyk@xtb.pl. Dawid jakby co ma wszystkie namiary, albo bezpośrednio przez Dawida, on mi przekaże i wtedy w dowolnych terminach, kiedy te grupy nam się zbiorą, zrobimy to u nas w siedzibie, w kameralnej, fajnej atmosferze. Nasi analitycy po prostu nauczą Was trochę, co to jest giełda, co to jest Forex, co się z tym na co dzień dzieje, jak to funkcjonuje i dlaczego coraz więcej ludzi w Polsce się tym interesuje. Także dziękuję bardzo i życzę miłego wieczoru, pełnego socjalowych wrażeń.
Cześć wszystkim. Słuchajcie, dzisiejsze wystąpienie będzie po angielsku, więc ja też się przyłączam na angielski. Hello everybody. I want to introduce a special guest tonight. It's Euan Semple. He came to us from London, but he's a Scottish guy, so I think you'll hear some Scottish accent. And he's a very respectable author, speaker, and social media consultant. He wrote a book called organization don't tweet, people do. And it's not about tweeting, like you might presume. It's about how organization can use social media tools to enable growth, to enable integration, collaboration, and so on and so on. So I'm very proud that Euan came to us. He came just for this event. He doesn't have any other business here, apart from you. So guys, please welcome Euan Semple and have a good time.
Thank you very much, David. In a strange way, this is very nostalgic for me. Firstly, because I used to play saxophone in a band and played in venues very much like this, competing with the bar. So this is bringing back memories. And the other reason it's nostalgic is that I used to work for the BBC. And a lot of that time was spent working for the BBC World Service. And I worked as a sound engineer, mixing and playing out and coordinating the output from the 43 different language services, one of which was Polish. So I spent many hours listening to Polish, editing Polish on bits of quarter-inch tape, but never understanding any more words of it than to Mówi London. So nostalgic. I'm always slightly wary of saying that I'm going to talk about social media because I'm not a big fan of the phrase. I think it has been turned into a thing that people buy, sell, feel pressured to do, and is very different from the thing that I got involved in 12 years ago, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And the two words cause problems in business, in organizational life. The word social, people still sort of think, what has being social got to do with being at work? And the word media causes problems because I think it continues the feeling that it's a channel down which you push stuff at people, which, as I will discuss, I don't think is what this is about. I got into it, as I say, 12 years ago, when I was called Director of Knowledge Management for the BBC, which is a dreadful job title. And knowledge management used to talk about capturing knowledge, which sounds like people running around with butterfly nets trying to capture stuff, or extracting knowledge, sucking stuff out of people's heads, or my favorite was knowledge harvesting, which sounds like some cerebral milking machine sucking stuff out of staff's heads and leaving empty husks at the back door. And then we wondered why nobody got involved in knowledge management. But on the internet, I was watching people on bulletin boards and forums sharing information with each other. I was managing editors at the time, and some of our editors were spending more time sharing information with people in other organizations all around the world on the internet than they were inside our organization. So I thought this was daft. Why don't we bring these tools inside? So we deployed a very simple, very low-cost bulletin board. We deployed blogs. We had a blogging server. We had wikis. And we ended up with, at its peak, 25,000 staff using these tools to do all sorts of things. Some of it to ask each other questions and get answers, and some of those were very mundane questions. You know, how do I transfer a telephone call in the internal phone system? Some of them were debates about what we were putting out in the evenings on our output. And basically we ended up with a very lively, very engaged group of people. So I got to see how you help that to happen in organizational life. And I left the BBC 7 years ago, and I now help other organizations to try and do the same thing. And I find it funny that even all this time later, 12 years later, most organizations, I don't know what it's like in Poland, but certainly in most of the places I work, most organizations are still very nervous about this. They might use social tools for marketing. They may have agencies doing their marketing for them. And some of them are beginning to deploy these tools amongst their staff, but they're still very nervous about it. These two pictures are of one common reaction to this. The top one is Nestle, and the bottom one is Thomas Cook. And these are their listening stations. It's really interesting how Nestle, if you maybe remember, a few years ago had a big group on Facebook, friends on Facebook, and then were being criticized for using palm oil or the way they were getting hold of the palm oil they use in their products. And things began to kick off on Facebook, and people were defacing the Nestle logo, and a guy I know who's in charge of that began to react badly to this, and it all got horribly messy and became quite a problem for Nestle. So they were woken up, if you like, to the risks of people having these conversations, and they now have this monitoring center, and those are big screens of just watching Facebook or Twitter or whatever else where people are talking about Nestle products. What I find fascinating is they have all that, but they still don't have a clue what to do when those conversations kick off. And then the bottom one, as I say, I just saw yesterday, this is Thomas Cook doing exactly the same thing. And the reason I'm showing those is that I think it's what I call the industrialization of social media. You know, what was in the early days just bloggers like me writing stories and connecting to other bloggers' stories and just building up networks and conversations has been taken in, has been assimilated by big organizations to make it look and feel like something they're more comfortable with, they're more familiar with. So one of the biggest concerns I have at the moment is, and one of the biggest risks to the opportunity that the internet has given us, is that we just turn it into the same old stuff. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of a book called The Clue Train Manifesto, but this was written 10 years ago by some guys who are now friends of mine, and they really put their finger on what it was about the internet that was making a difference and going to make a difference. And even 10 years on, they were very, very accurate. And this sentence, for me, summed up partly what I was trying to do inside the BBC, but also I think what's important and special about the internet, that is globally distributed, near instant, person-to-person conversations. And the fact that I can cross all sorts of geographical and political boundaries and connect with bloggers in Iran or China or whatever, but equally inside a large siloed organization can cross those organizational boundaries is important. The speed at which we can communicate is intimidating to people like my former employer, the BBC. You know, news journalists turn up to situations like North Africa, and the story is already happening. The story is already getting around the world, and their role is having to change as a consequence. And likewise, companies who've paid communications or PR groups to do their communication for them are disconcerted by the speed that this is happening. But the optimistic aspect of it is that it is person to person. That's why my book's called Organizations Don't Tweet, People Do. Because even if somebody is tweeting on behalf of a large organization, it's still someone putting their hands on a keyboard and pressing send or save. And we saw this in the UK recently. Some of you may have heard the story about HMV, the record company. And they, because the high street shops are getting less business, were having to make significant cutbacks in their staff, including the 60 people that were in their social media team. One of the tweeters decided to tweet the process of being fired. So she starts tweeting that we are about to be sacked and starts describing the process. And of course, thousands of us on the internet start following this spectator sport of watching this group of people being sacked, including the director of marketing apparently storming around the office saying, "How do I turn off Twitter?" Which I think makes him unemployable as a head of marketing. But it's the fact that he'd given this powerful tool to this individual who had chosen to do something with it that he couldn't control. These are all platforms, tools that we're using on our own devices. You know, the reason I've used screen grabs from my mobile phone is that that's how I access this stuff 90% of the time. So when I work with organizations that say they have banned Facebook at work, I ask if they've taken all their staff's phones from them, because unless they do that, they've banned nothing. But I worked with an insurance company the other day there who said, "Oh, we do take their phones from them." So my response was, "Bugger working for you then." But again, it's just interesting, this naivety about this. Equally, because it's a personal device that's, I was going to say it's close to my chest, it's actually close to another bit of my anatomy that I care about. But if my manager or advertisers are going to be allowed into that space, they have to behave themselves. I won't allow them, I won't pay attention to them in that intimate device unless they act differently. Just to touch on the first screen grab there, which is my blog. Blogging's kind of old school and not as sexy as some of the other stuff, but I think it's still the most powerful tool. It's the place where I get to be me, where I get to think in more than 140 characters, where I can create a presence, if you like. And in the context of work, getting specialists to establish that kind of presence can be very powerful. So, for instance, I'm working with one of the big oil companies at the moment who got themselves into a mess in America. And I'm suggesting to them that if they helped their specialists, their environmental specialists, their guys who do care about the environment, to use blogs, to begin to be seen to be knowledgeable, to begin to be seen to be trustworthy, then unlike paying an agency, which is what they did, they sort of ticked the social media box by paying, I think it was Ogilvy, to do their social media for them. That didn't work. If they can begin to find their own voice and say what they think in public, that arguably makes them stronger. Twitter, on the end there, when I first saw Twitter, I thought, I need this like a hole in the head. More people's inane rubbish. And if you don't invest time in Twitter, that's what you get. But it's ended up being an indispensable tool for me for two reasons. One is it filters the web for me. I only follow 100 people on Twitter, so I don't follow celebrities. I very rarely follow companies. But I follow 100 smart people who I can trust to find the good stuff. But it also acts as a help to me. So the other day I was doing a webinar with a university in America, and there was about this size of audience on the other side of the Atlantic waiting for me to speak through my laptop. And for some reason, the software they were using wasn't finding the camera. And I was looking at the prospect of those people being faced with a blank screen. And I was desperately trying to search through the help files to find the answer. Couldn't find it. I tried to get hold of the help desk, and there was nobody there. But I pushed the question into Twitter. And within 10 seconds, 4 people had told me the settings to change. And I was able to go on and do the thing effectively. Now, I can't think of another way that would happen. But it happened because out of the 8,000 people or so who follow me on Twitter, enough of them were online, enough of them knew the answer, and enough of them were well disposed towards me and were willing to help me. Now that was because, presumably over the years, I've helped them enough. I've offered enough information that's been useful. I've not spammed them with too much stuff that's not necessary. So by managing that reciprocity on a platform like Twitter, I have this really valuable resource. All of these tools work on the basis of noticing things. When you start blogging, you start to notice more. You become more aware, more thoughtful. Again, one of the benefits of using them in the context of work. Why does that happen? Why does this work? What did we do the last time? And even if you don't publish the blog post, you benefit from having thought harder about things. But if you write a good blog post, then other people go, oh, that is interesting. I didn't know that, or I disagree with that. And it's like lobbing a pebble into a pond and causing ripples. And you get better at lobbing bigger pebbles into bigger ponds and getting more benefit. And it's teaching us to point to things. When Tim Berners-Lee invented the web, it gave us this ability to say, go and read that document, or talk to that person, or go and see this film at this cinema. And even in the slightly corrupted form of Facebook like buttons or Google plus buttons, it's the same thing. It's pointing to what's worthwhile. It's filtering and selecting. And then we work out how to use tools like hashtags to help us navigate to the good stuff. So it was actually a friend of mine, Chris Messina, who one day, well, just to go back, when Twitter first started, it was literally just 140 characters. So even the @ sign was just users like me using the @ sign to say this at Euan means this is about or for Euan. Because we kept using it, Twitter incorporated it into the software. And as I say, Chris, 5 years ago, one day said, why don't we put metadata on our tweets? Why don't we use the pound sign to say this tweet is about this word? Who would have guessed that 5 years later, companies would be gaming hashtags to try and get onto the trending topics on Twitter, or it would appear in captions on television programs, or it's bizarre. In fact, I was in Australia last November, and one of the events that I did, the organizer took me to this club in Sydney. It's quite a posh club with swimming pools and bars. And he's this good-looking little French person who decided to take me to this special room in the club. So we're through the back and we knock on this door and we go in and there's these gorgeous women in scantily clad clothing. And I'm thinking, God, you know, I'm a 53-year-old married man. What's he doing? So we're sitting on this sofa chatting. And one of these girls was sort of leaning over the sofa chatting with us. And we got into the conversation about the internet. And it was about the anniversary of Chris inventing the hashtag. So I told the story and revealed the fact that he was a friend of mine. And this girl said, you know the guy who invented the hashtag? And I thought, how weird is that? You know? 5 years later, this nerdy bloke with a solution to a nerdy problem suddenly becomes cool. And it's appropriate, really, this slide in this venue, that I think what we're generally seeing, and I can see more and more of this happening, is sort of a deindustrialization of stuff. You know, I worked in a big corporation for 21 years of my life, and I watched it being horrendously inefficient and a soulless kind of place to go and work and spend your lives. And I think more and more of those big institutions are beginning to crumble under their own bureaucratic weight, and that we're beginning to build something up from the bottom with these tools that I think will ultimately replace it. But watching companies trying to do this at the moment is uncomfortable. I describe it as like watching your dad dancing at a disco. You're proud of him for having a go, but you really wish he would sit down. And this is what it's like watching them trying to adopt these behaviors. Now, I think the way you adopt them, going back to the deindustrial thing and my comment about assimilation, many corporations either have big social media announcements on the internet, or they have big initiatives inside the organization, but actually this stuff happens one person at a time, and for their reasons and not the organization's. So this idea of Trojan mice appeals, and it's a British guy who came up with it, and it's unlike a big Trojan horse. These are little things that don't cost much money, that don't take much effort, but that consistently over time build into something worthwhile. So you start by just doing that first tweet. You start by having your first corporate blog, and you keep trying things, and you have a throwaway kind of attitude that if it doesn't work, you do something else, and you keep trying. It's iterative. It's organic. But it relies on people finding their voice, and this is the biggest single challenge, I think, in organizational life, and we were talking about this earlier this evening. Being scared of saying what you think at work, being scared of being disapproved of by your boss, or being laughed at by the public, is something that is really non-trivial in terms of beginning to adopt these tools. But if you do, and as individuals, the prospect is there to, as David Weinberger once described it, writing ourselves into existence. There's almost a therapeutic aspect to writing things, having feedback, writing again and having feedback, that I now, having blogged for 12 years, it's just part of me. And it feels like having an outboard brain. It feels like your synapses go beyond your own skull. So the prospect is there, I believe, for everyone to begin to engage in this. And once you've done that for a while, you leave traces. So on the internet, I have a modest brand because I do this. I can do this as an individual. when I left the BBC, I was actually made redundant, which is probably no advert for getting involved in this. But the week before I was made redundant, I was asked to take part in a senior level meeting on how to prevent knowledge leaving the BBC. How ironic is that? But unlike most people who left, I had left traces. I had left paths that people could discover. And something else that organizations find hard about this is the feeling that there's more than enough information to cope with already. They don't want more mess. So they try to keep the mess tidy. But unless you allow people to be messy, unless you allow them to express themselves and find their voices, you end up with the sanitized management speak that we now all speak to each other that doesn't actually say anything. Companies are coming under pressure to do this because some of them are getting involved in the outside world. Some of them are doing this as a marketing exercise. Most organizations are being talked about on the internet, whether they like it or not. But what happens is those fast-moving conversations, if they're aware of them, then meet the world inside. Where if somebody's going to respond on a blog, they have to get 14 people to sign it off, and it takes them a day to do that at the best. So the speed of the outside conversations are going faster than the inside conversations. And I think this is ultimately having an effect on brand. You know, brand in the old days meant highly polished, managed, protected images of organizations. But increasingly, I don't think we trust those images as much anymore. We know they're fabricated. We know they're not real. What we're learning to trust is each other and our conversations about products. And so this is where I think the possibility is there for organizations and the individuals in them to increasingly allow staff to talk about products, help staff to be open on the internet about what they do and why they do it. And for those who are nervous, you know, Dave Weiner, who invented RSS, once said, if you don't want me to slag off your product on the internet, don't have a shit product. And that's the, or have a dodgy government or a whatever. That's what they're nervous about, not just the internet. So last story, I have a crumpler bag that I use for traveling, which has a very thick strap. And I decided to lengthen this strap to fit my long body, but then couldn't work out how to relace it. So I'm flapping my way around the world's airports, annoying other passengers with this bag. And then 2 years ago, somebody in Crumpler UK started to follow me on Twitter. So I said, seeing as you're there, can you explain to me how to relace my bag strap? Whoever it was made a brave attempt in 140 characters to explain this complicated process, failed miserably. So I said, I don't understand, I'm none the wiser. They said, okay, give me an hour. And then an hour later, they sent me a hyperlink to this Flickr page, which has a sequence of 6 photographs showing me how to relace my bag strap. I'm well chuffed. So I talk about Crumpler on the internet. I talk about them on stages. I still get about 100 hits a day on my blog from people looking for how do I relace my Crumpler bag strap. But then I had a problem with the zip. And so I go back to look for my friend at Crumpler and got no response. So whether they'd been sacked for using Twitter at work or more likely had just moved on and not been replaced, the point of the story was that I had had a direct connection with a person in an organization that made me feel good about that organization, but they then didn't sustain it. So I felt let down. And so I now tell that negative story about the organization. And my last slide, second last slide, is David Weinberger again once said that what makes the internet hang together isn't internet protocol, it's not technology, it's the basic human desire to be connected to each other. This is why like buttons matter on Facebook, why having somebody comment on your blog post matters. It's that feeling of having been recognized and heard and acknowledged. And I think this is what's becoming possible or an opportunity at work. Many of us have led very sanitized, very dispassionate work lives. You know, you work for 40 years, buy stuff till you die, and that's it. I think the prospect is there for companies to become much more passionate about what they do, to care what they do. The customers increasingly, I think, will expect them and want them to care what they do and have direct relationships and enable real conversations with real people about real products. So on that note, thank you very much for listening.
Now, Ilona, please come here. We'll have a short discussion, and Ilona will ask maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then you will have the chance to ask Euan anything.
So, Euan, thanks for the great presentation.
My pleasure.
Głośniej? Okay. You mentioned during your presentation that, and it's no secret, you're friends with many, many famous people connected to the internet industry. So I have one question to start. Is it true that you were in jacuzzi with Robert Scoble?
Did I what, sorry? In a jacuzzi?
Yeah.
Yes, I was in a jacuzzi with Robert Scoble. How horrifying is that, as I thought? It was in Geneva at a conference called Lift. And the organizer, I get to go to some good parties doing this. He had a friend who had a chalet up in the Alps with an outdoor jacuzzi. And Robert and I were both speakers. So we ended up sitting in this jacuzzi looking at stars in the sky above the Alps, drinking 104-year-old cognac.
Very romantic.
Yes. That was as far as it went. But as I said to him last week, I'm very glad he didn't have Google Glass at the time.
That was supposed to be my next question. Well, anything interesting that he shared with you in the jacuzzi? Like, did you talk about what's going to be the next big thing in the internet?
That sentence started off bad and just got worse, didn't it? My, that's a big thing, Robert. What I did learn was watching Robert dealing with the amount of connections he has, because he has hundreds of thousands of people that follow him on various platforms. And it always fascinates me that if I say something, he comes back really quite quickly. And watching him sitting at his laptop, just constantly, following stuff, responding, following stuff, responding. And this was, a long time ago. This was about 7 years ago that I was watching this. And I suppose to others, maybe in a more modest way, I look the same. But it was, Robert isn't normal, but he's a sign of some of the aspects of this, both good and bad. So it was fascinating just to see that.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned this aspect. I wanted to ask you how you're working for so many years within the social media industry, how it changed your personal life, because I know that one of your daughters, or even both of them, are blogging.
Yep.
So do you think they would be blogging if you were not be doing what you're doing? And do you advise them on how to be a good blogger as well?
Well, firstly, I don't think I work in an industry.
Okay.
Interesting question. Certainly, I think it helps them. Well, put it this way, I was interviewed on television in the UK a while back about the risks to children on the internet. And I said 2 things. Well, the first thing was that I think the media actually are partly to blame for this, because they make the parents so scared of the internet and paranoid about the internet that the parents don't learn enough about the internet to have informed conversations with their children. But I was with someone the other day who was making some valid points about some risks. So I decided to act like a dad and have a word with my children. And I sat them down and I said, look, girls, I know you know what you're doing, and I know you think I'm silly for mentioning this, but just remember to make sure you know who you're talking to on the internet. And they both went, oh, Dad, and looked at me as if I was some kind of moron. So, I'm at great risk of looking like the dad dancing at the disco. But in terms of my daughter blogging, we just gave her a tool called Scrivener for the Mac, which allows you to write easily. And the next thing I knew, she'd written 40,000 words of a novel. And then she decided she wanted a blog, and she decided to do that. So I think most kids have that innate desire to express themselves. Now, yes, having a dad who does it is going to make that an avenue that's more available to her than other parents. But as I say, going back to my first point, this is why I'm sad that so many parents are still very hands-off with the internet.
Here in Poland, and I know David asked you about this on the interview that was published here in Poland, in Polish. He asked you about Facebook because there's a huge focus on Facebook as a marketing tool here on the Polish market.
Yep.
But we see and we observe all around the world that many people are actually right now resigning
Yep.
From Facebook, closing their accounts. At the same time, first of all, what do you think is the reason for this, and what's the the nearest future of Facebook, and what does it mean for marketers? But also, what's the alternative? Because there's really not a second big thing. It was like MySpace, and then there was Facebook, and they were always
there was lots, Rise, Friendster, Orkut. There's been dozens.
Yeah.
AOL. In some ways, Facebook is just a modern AOL. Mm-hmm. Where it's different is just the numbers, the scale. And for so much of the population, it's their first experience of the internet. They think it's the internet, half of them. So it's not surprising that once they become more mature in their use, they become more aware of the downsides and the consequences of Facebook being a proprietary platform, the balancing act between getting a free tool and being advertised at. I was in Saudi Arabia on Wednesday talking at a conference about data, big data, and marketing, where all these people were excited about the patterns that Facebook made visible that you could target your marketing. Now, I keep getting adverts on Facebook for self-administered catheters and bespoke radiator cabinets, right? So Facebook has obviously decided that demographically, because I'm over 50, my body's stopping working and I'm interested in things for my house. Today, I got an advert for an electrically heated horse blanket. I hate horses. And so I think that, that's enervating. That's just noise that's getting in the way of me doing other things. And I think more people, especially, lots of teenagers in the UK are moving off Facebook onto Twitter because it just gets them away from that. But I think in the future, I hope we don't have that monoculture again. I hope it splits into, there's two risks. I think my hope is it splits into more relevant and pertinent tools that we can get more fragmented. But equally, I hope those tools adhere to internet standards, so that we can choose to leapfrog into other communities, because the risk is we all fragment into echo chambers.
Okay. Any questions from the audience?
Hi, my name's Mark. I'm actually from London.
I was going to say your accent's very good.
It was a dead giveaway. From the talk earlier, there was one focus seemed to be about companies and social media and who's controlling this kind of contact.
Yep.
How aware should employees be about the conversations happening about the company? So how aware should the average employee be, and who should be aware of it? Because often it seems that you have, let's say, a small group who's like monitoring things and then, let's say, informing people within the company about what's happening outside.
Yep. Well, I think that's a consequence of us having professionalized so much of our work life. So you have a professional comms department, or you have a professional PR department, and then everybody else is just consigned to being amateurs. But actually those professionals have professionalized themselves out of touch. So they're not part of the networks themselves, and they struggle with it. And even if they were, being a small number, I would argue they're increasingly going to struggle to keep up with the scale and the speed of the conversations, no matter how many fancy monitoring centers they have. So, I wrote a chapter in a book recently where I said that your staff are your best advocates. And I think more and more staff are struggling, as you sort of suggested, to work out when they're online. Are they allowed to talk about work? If they are, what are they meant to say, or what can't they say? If they see something happening, are they allowed to respond or not? And so I think companies are going to have to, and this is where I think professional communications people have to shift from doing it for people to helping people to do it better for themselves. So help them understand and get faster and better at reacting to these situations. And even internally, going back to horses, you're probably aware of horse meat ending up in beef burgers in the UK. If Tesco had had a big enough, grown up enough, lively enough internal network, then when somebody said, has anybody else noticed the horse, something might have been done about it. So again, I think inside or outside, individuals are going to take more responsibility.
My name is Adam, and I got a question. Can you agree with the fact that, let's say, Facebook and Twitter is a part right now of the marketing of bigger companies, and you just need it? You just have to have the person who is an expert in that, and the only thing which might help you using Facebook is when you're making your internet startup. So, or you just making a startup, making your own business, or you just have it because you're running big enough company to connect with your customers.
I didn't quite understand that question, I'm afraid. Try again.
Okay. Do you agree that the only positive thing for your own business is social media when you're starting your own business as a startup?
Big companies trying to work in this way and how difficult it is for them, and they almost have to get small groups to do it because they can't deal with it any other way. I sometimes feel as if I spend my work life trying to resuscitate dinosaurs, that it would be better just to let them die and grow something else faster. And I do think that startups, especially startups employing people who've grown up on the net, just see this as how you do stuff. Yeah.
Questions? Oh, 3 rising hands.
Don't tell my clients that I called them dinosaurs, by the way. There's some very nice dinosaurs.
Sebastian?
Hi.
You said something, actually many interesting things, but one of them was actually that you are not from the social media industry, which is really cool, I believe. Could you maybe say why not? Social media is not an industry.
Because it's about people and individuals and relationships, and to industrialize that just seems counterintuitive to me. And it's also allowing, as I said, people to stay in a comfort zone of products. You buy your social media from somebody else. I mean, somebody inside the BBC once called me an organisational anarchist, and I was quite pleased. I thought I could have that on a T-shirt. That's quite good, although I might not get to work with NATO so often. But I do think that this is something about individuals. I mean, the first chapter in the book is called "We All Need to Grow Up," and I think that, like the printing press, this is going to bring about societal changes that we're really at the very start of. It's going to take 50 years before we really see the consequences of this stuff. And I think to turn it into an industry and make it look like what we've already been doing for the last 50 years is underestimating the opportunity.
Hi, my name is Gosia.
Stand up so I can see you.
I'm here.
Oh, hi there.
What I'm looking for is to empower internal communication and collaboration in a small company or medium company. Do you know any tools I could start to use?
Interesting.
I know you come from BBC, it's quite a large company, so.
Well, I mean, it's raised the topic of tools. I mean, again, I watch some of my clients spending huge amounts of money on things like Jive or Yammer or Tibber, which are enterprise social platforms. But again, it's just turning it back into, the old fantasies about executive dashboards, and, it's lots of money, not much return, and people being busy with technology rather than talking about culture and change. So I still think it's possible to do what we did, which is use free, low-cost, small tools. Having a range of different tools as well, I think, matters, because there's this technologists all would want to build everything into the same platform because they think it makes it easier. But when I look at Jive, I get confused because I can't work out what I'm meant to be doing. You know, is this bit the blog bit or the Twitter bit or the wiki bit? We kept our tools in the BBC separate, so the tools were different places, they looked different, and if you wanted to join them up, then you just hyperlinked between the conversations. So I would still advocate spending as little money as you can, and this is maybe because I'm a Scot, and growing things back to the Trojan mice, growing things incrementally as people use them. One thing about size that matters is if you've got a small company, unless you're a startup where everybody gets it, you may not have enough conversations to generate energy. So, you know, sometimes think you need to be about 2,000 people to get enough people interested enough and talking enough to make the thing have a pulse. So that's another issue.
Okay, hello. I have a question. I actually work in a big company, and I think maybe I sometimes feel like an anarchist, like you said. Could you give some interesting examples of how you dealt with individuals when you tried to be an evangelist inside the company? Because this is the most interesting thing for me. How do you actually make individual people, especially those who are sort of, you know, in the upper ranks in the company, how do you make them believe that things like Twitter blogging works? And could you give some human examples, please?
Well, I mean, there is a chapter in the book about how to deal with your boss if he doesn't get it, and using the phrase "not getting it" is in itself a problem because you're being dismissive and you know, a lot of my work, you know, my grey hair has become a unique selling point to clients because I'm of an age with most of these guys. I've been a senior manager myself. I can relate to the worries that they have, but you just find little cracks in the armor, if you like, and little stories or little things and finding out ways that you can anticipate it making a difference to them. And one of the biggest ones, I think, is the fact that this, you know, people talk about this as if it was some sort of bottom-up thing. I don't think it is at all. I think that there's as much potential for the middle and the top of organizations. And they get frustrated at not being listened to. The senior people get very frustrated at not really knowing what's going on in their organization because they don't feel close to it. So, for instance, when I left the BBC, there was one of the IT managers, a senior manager, who'd been quite dismissive and quite aggressive against what we'd done. And I went to see him and said, look, we're leaving. Nobody's really taking on management of the tools. Can you leave it? You know, not. He said, oh, I've learned far too much from that tool. I would never want to shut it down now. So even being a lurker has a value to a lot of these people. But I genuinely think it's about having conversations with each of them. And just finding, and that's not always easy in itself. And picking the ones you have the conversations with. You know, I could tell in meetings, you just know the ones whose eyes light up and who look interested, and the ones who just have that glazed, dead look. Don't talk to the ones with the glazed, dead look, you know, because life's too short, and you've only got so much energy, and you have to spend that where you get the greatest return. You also have to keep doing it. Many, many times in some cases. One thing that I did that might be worth thinking about is there was a leadership program at the BBC, which was a whole series of away days and courses. And I managed to get myself on the design of that course, and also I ran a session within that course. So I had thousands of conscript managers forced to listen to me. And I just knew that out of those hundreds, thousands, whatever, 10% would be interested and 10% of them would actually begin to do something. And I think, which is something else worth mentioning, time scales matter. You know, you just have to be patient. And that's why it's harder now, because it's been turned into a thing that people, you know, chief execs say, yeah, well, I want you to do social media and I want it all happening in 6 months, you know. It's not going to happen. So you have to manage the expectations and be very tactical about what you do.
I just have one follow-up question for this one, because business executives and high top managers are very, very responsive to numbers and ROI and stuff like that. So how do you actually define success in social media for a company, and how do you advise them on, you know, measuring it? in short-term and long-term perspective?
It was again easier for me because they didn't know what it was. So I could avoid the people who asked the ROI question. And I just tried to make it big enough and useful enough to enough people that they wouldn't ask it. Because it's very hard to put a value on it. Now, ironically, it's immensely quantifiable. You can quantify to the nth degree how many people have logged on, how much time they spent, how much productive time they spent. You can measure all of that stuff. But the argument I'm beginning to make to the senior people is that you're putting me under pressure to justify the ROI of doing something. This is happening anyway, whether you like it or not. So you explain to me the ROI of stopping it.
Maybe it's in your book, but I didn't read it yet. I'm sorry.
Okay. You're forgiven.
A big fear of giving the power to the people, at least at my company, which is a big B2B company,
yes,
is that they will build their brand and run away.
Yep.
Or they will build their brand and somebody else will snatch them from us.
Yep.
What do you say to executives who are afraid of giving the power to the people, but with the clear fear of losing those people to other companies?
I was once lucky enough to hear the management guru Peter Drucker speaking in America. And this was in the days of me being involved in knowledge management. And he said, in a knowledge economy, there are no such thing as conscripts. There are only volunteers. Trouble is, we've trained our managers to manage conscripts. And I think that's what we're beginning to see now, that as individuals, with knowledge, with skills, we have more clout, we have more leverage, arguably, than we've ever had before. And that's where I think managers and organizations are going to have to adjust to that, and they're going to have to work harder to attract and retain the clever people that they will need to be successful. Sort of behind the question as well was, it doesn't mean that everything has to be management by committee either. You know, there are some things that people just have to decide, and if you're in a senior enough position, then you decide that. But if you use these tools to explain your decision, you know, I think the days when managers could simply manage by authority are disappearing fast. Just because you've got a job title doesn't mean it's like the old joke. The good news is you have 200 people working for you. The bad news is they don't see it that way. And that's so. But if you use these tools and you become effective at explaining priorities and needs, then it's a benefit, not a risk. So the weaker managers will struggle with this. That's for sure. But equally, I mean, the other thing is they're all scared about people wasting their time. Well, if you're employing untrustworthy morons, what do you expect? You know? And even if you have, the great thing about these tools is it shows you who the morons are. You know, you get to find out who the time wasters are, what's not to like.
I'm Martina, and I have a question because for some brands, for example, connect with alcohol or cigarettes, existing in some channels is more difficult because of Polish law, because they don't sure about how old are their fans.
Right.
And I wondered, because these brands can only observe these activities, okay, on these channels, and maybe they can invite to existing channels. It's effective, it's optimal. I didn't know that.
Sorry, explain that last bit about inviting to...
Yes, inviting to some existing channels, for example, for Facebook page, these fans.
If you've got an underage drinking fan, you've got a problem
no,
anyway.
you just don't sure about that, okay? You can't verifying it.
Right. I have to be careful here as an ex-heavy drinker and smoker. Okay, maybe answer it obliquely. I think the problem is that the law is lagging behind this world. So a lot of the legislation was written for different circumstances, and trying to apply that legislation to this environment is hard. And the other thing is that those who are writing even the current legislation don't actually understand the world they're legislating for. So I think broadly we still need protection, we still need guidelines, but we need them written in a way that we can use in these environments.
Hi, I'm Martha. I actually have a question that sort of builds on your past in the BBC in a way, because from what I understand, because I myself am completely outside social media in any way, shape, or form. I am a member of a huge corporation, and that's my world. Yeah. However, I'm actually very happy about that. Would you actually say that since social media is about giving power to the people, would a label such as, let's say, economic development of a given country, of a given environment that the people are in, does it actually influence their susceptibility to take that power and write back and get involved and do something?
Yes, I mean, I work all around the world, and different cultures have different reactions to this, and I'm very wary of a kind of an American assumption that everybody wants, has to be democratic, and the American way is the only way. So there's a real risk of that, for sure. But I think part of the reason I enjoy what I do so much is that there is something very enabling about it in any circumstance. And it's hard to envisage a world where there isn't even a modest desire to find your own voice and shape your own destiny. And these tools give us a better chance of doing that than we've had for hundreds of years.
All right, I hope the answer is going to be not too sad for the end. I have a question. When you were talking about Twitter and the way you use it, you said it filters the internet for you. Yep. You mentioned there's around 100 of people that you follow, but still 100 of people and probably 100 of posts a day, it's still a lot of information to filter and a lot of knowledge that you have to get through. Yep. It's probably safe, probably safe to assume that this is just one source of information that you get. Yep. So do you ever get intimidated by the urge to get more and more information? And can you take a break?
Good question.
Yeah.
I'm going to my home country of Scotland next week to go and climb some mountains. I also try to stick to a sort of meditation regime, if you like, because having been immersed in this for as long as I have, I've realized that you can't do it full on all the time. It's not good for you. Just to go back to your question, you said a lot of information to have to keep up with. I don't have to keep up with it. And that's something else you learn. You just have as much as you can with an appropriate amount of time and effort, and then you make the decisions you have to make. And you stop worrying about all the other stuff that you haven't seen. Or in the context of work, you have to say no to more people because you've only got so much time and so much, Clay Shirky's stuff about the attention economy. We've only got so much. So you get better at investing your time in the best ways of getting the best value out of these things, part of which is learning to shut them off and stop and think. And you do whatever it takes to do that.
So next week we're going to have a technology detox in
No, I'm going to be posting photographs of me on top of mountains to Facebook.
Okay, so we will be following this.
But I will be switching it off while I'm climbing the mountain.
Okay, well thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I encourage all of you to network with Euan by the bar or somewhere close.
And I'll be drinking water.
And he will be drinking water. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Teraz mała przerwa i zapraszam później na prezentację bardzo ciekawą Michała Judy i Jaśka Stasza na temat showroomu i na temat tego, jak na Facebooku sobie świetnie radzą. Jak można robić pieniądze z Facebooka.